Let me go over it again. All of the evidence we have supports there was a beginning to the universe.
Mm-hmm.
There is no evidence saying that the universe is eternal anymore.
Well, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, all rise and welcome to another episode of All Rise. This is a podcast hosted by me, Abdu Murray, where we take a look at objections against and claims in favor of the Christian faith from a legal perspective. And basically what that means is we take a look at the rules of evidence, we take a look at trial procedures, the way judges think, the way juries think, the way courts deliberate over evidence. And over claims as well, especially the way lawyers try to present their cases and the way juries are instructed to actually evaluate those cases. Today, we're going to be focusing on the objection, science has left no more room for faith. And we've been talking with my good friend Scott Symington, who's got a physics background and works in a medical physics capacity to this day. And we've been talking about the various ideas of science and faith. And we've been sort of in the previous episode, and if you're gonna get anything out of this episode, I would highly recommend you actually look at the previous episode where we had a lengthy discussion about some of the philosophical and underlying methodological issues between science and faith, or science and theology. What do these terms really mean? What is the foundation for science? What is the foundation of theology and faith? And how do these things actually interact? And at the end of the conversation, we talked about a thing that Scott was referring to called STOMA, which is the idea of the overlap of science and theology, and where they have a symbiotic, trending, overlapping magisteria, which is a very fancy way of saying, essentially, that science and matters of theology or matters of faith actually have an overlapping sense this side of heaven, where they actually begin to complement each other. They're symbiotically reliant on each other, and the data is trending upwards where the overlap is getting stronger and stronger. So we're going to tackle some of the topics that we just touched on briefly, because as Scott was explaining his approach to this, we had a lot of claims that were being made, and we want to be able to go back into some of those claims, including some of the trends we saw, or that Scott actually had alluded to, not that we saw, but that he alluded to, in terms of the way that the trending scientific information that we're discovering tends more and more toward an understanding that not only does God exist and God is behind all of this, but that it is specifically the God of the Bible that's that way. Now, that's quite a claim, and you have to back that kind of a thing up, and we're going to do that in this episode. If you want to go through some of Scott's bona fides and some of the qualifications he had, we did go through that in the previous episode. I'm going to raise some objections during the course of this episode that we're going to have Scott look at and respond to, and we're going to have a fun conversation on an extremely important topic of the interaction of matters of faith or theology and science, especially from a Christian perspective. So with that, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we're going to talk with Scott Symington. So we're back. Scott, thanks for doing part two. Appreciate it. We had a lot of fun in part one. Maybe a little too much fun. We were going off on maybe not too long, but definitely very involved.
Yeah.
And it was a lot of fun. So we had left off where you had basically explained STOMA to us, and we're talking about trends. And one of the unique things you've contributed to this conversation about whether there is an overlap between these sort of magisteria of science and theology is you talk about a symbiotic but also trending overlap that's happening here. And I think the trend is something you've contributed to this as well. And it's not necessarily a theory that you're contributing as much as it's an observation that you're seeing, and you're saying, we have to be talking about this. We're leaving something important out of the conversation.
Which makes it a new model of the interaction, because without that, you'd be at the complex contextualized, which was a previous one of the more modern models. So this one steps away from that by adding a part that this missed. Yep.
So he just laid a term down, and that term was actually covered fairly extensively in the previous episode. So if you want to talk about the contextualized thing, you got to go back to the previous episode, and we'll get to there as well. So let's talk about some specifics now.
Yeah.
And what I want to focus it on is I want to do this in a phased way. Hopefully we can, to be scientific.
Yeah.
I want to do this in a way that goes from beginnings and origins or causes to some design stuff as well. And let's focus on beginnings and that kind of thing. If we have time, we'll get to the design stuff, but let's focus first on cause and some philosophical issues we have to cover, but also just from the scientific observations and the trends upward on cause. I know there's some things you'd like to contribute. Now, before I do that, so when laying the groundwork on this kind of thing, we talk about the beginning of the universe, and there's going to be some stuff on multiverse we're going to talk about, because that goes into the whole idea of cause, but also design. And there's some, strangely enough, ironically, maybe even poetically, multiverse talks about cause, but it has a overlapping issue with regard to a design as well. So let's talk about cause, because we often are wrestling with what caused all of this stuff. There's got to be some kind of a cause, and it's not an immaterial conversation. I mean, I remember hearing one famous atheist, and I don't want to say the names, I don't remember the name, and I don't want to attribute to the wrong person, who had said basically that any conversations about the cause of the universe are essentially meaningless because they don't help us in any way, shape, or form. They don't really get us anywhere. Biology and evolution, yes, but this doesn't get us anywhere because it's such an abstract idea. Who cares, in one sense? But this is the signals of transcendence we talked about before. Surely this has meaning. Surely this idea of how we got here has meaning, because if we are created on purpose for a purpose, then it's not just meaningless, and our lives, even when there's suffering and there's pain, actually are fitting into some kind of a plan of some kind, or at least someone's paying attention. That's at least the possibility there. So this is not a meaningless question. So I say that not to have you comment necessarily on the meaning of the question, although please feel free to, but really to talk about the importance of the question of cause. How you think of how we got here informs why you think we're here. And why you think we're here informs why you think the world is the way it is and how could it be better. So it all overlaps.
So the scientist who said that, he stepped out of the science circle into the philosophy circle to make the claim, and he didn't do it very well. That was bad philosophy.
Yeah.
If you think about it, this is a foundational question. It's one of the big questions for a reason. I could show you a picture of, I usually show like a picture of a battery with fishing line at one end, fishing line longer one at the other. And I say, what's the purpose of this? And people make their guesses. And a lot of times I say, hey, yeah, you could use it for this. But who knows what the purpose this thing was created for? Only the designer, the one who made it. That's the only one that could give you what its for sure actual objective purpose is. And I used to make that to knock on people's doors from a distance and then have them think that there was a person knocking there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
That was the purpose.
You are a trickster.
So,
you're like the Loki of the science world.
Oh, nice. That was quick. So the thing is, purpose is kind of important.
Yeah.
What's the meaning of life, purpose of life? Well, there's only two possibilities. If there is one that created us with a purpose, only that designer, that who, would be able to tell us what the objective purpose with a capital P is.
Yeah.
We'd have the objective purpose. We could have other little purposes with little p's. If there is no God, if it's all random chance, then we just have to invent whatever our own purpose is for our life, and no one could say one's better than the other. It's just a bunch of little lowercase p's.
Yeah.
So purpose to life is all wrapped up in it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And meaning of life and value and so on.
So let's get to cause then, because cause is the starting point. You know, if I were to have you just opine about design, and the other side would rightfully say objection assumes facts, not an evidence, which essentially is that there's a designer at all because we don't know if this thing was caused in the first place. So if you're assuming that there's a design caused by the causer, as it were, you're assuming that a cause exists. And so it would be a valid objection to say, first you have to establish that this thing was caused, as opposed to, because there's steady state theory that the universe has always existed, which is no longer really held by anybody, I don't think, or at least most people don't really hold to that theory, but that things began at a finite point in the past. How long ago isn't the point, but the fact is that it did be, or at least the prevailing standard model is that things began at a finite point in the past. So we're not basing this on some like weird theory that's just yours. This is sort of established. So go through that a little bit with us, that this is, is it established in the literature that essentially this had started at some point. And then is there a cause other than just it happened?
Yeah, and it's funny, the guy who had the steady state theory, Sir Frederick Hoyle, he was one of the top astronomers at the time. When Einstein and Hubble brought them evidence that, hey, there might be a beginning, he said, that's scientific genesis. And then in an interview later, he called it, what was it, a Big Bang, to kind of make fun of it.
Yeah.
And that's where the name's kind of stuck.
Okay.
So as far as, I'm trying to get back to what the initial, evidence for, okay, so I was challenged on this. So I did say that the universe had a beginning, and because of this, we've learned about properties, what the cause was. When I was done, and I gave all the evidence there was a beginning, when I was done, this professor put his hand up and he said, well, there's a whole bunch of other theories as far as that there was no beginning. So he's like, so doesn't that just invalidate everything you just said? And I said, did you hear what I just covered? I went and I had to basically tell him, let me go over it again. All of the evidence we have supports there was a beginning to the universe. There is no evidence saying that the universe is eternal anymore. When all the evidence is on one side and there's no evidence on the other, even an Ohio State University football player can figure out what that means.
All right. So those of you who are Buckeyes,
I have angst.
It's been both
20 years of.
We are both U of M guys.
Yeah.
So please forgive us. But go ahead.
So all the evidence we have supports there was a beginning to the universe. Now, has the Big Bang been adjusted? Yeah, that's what good theories do. Over time, when more evidence comes in, it might get adjusted. There's a parameterization of it called the lambda cold dark matter model of the Big Bang, but it supports everything that we said. The universe had a beginning.
Yeah.
And there's
whether it's a straight cone or it looks like a badminton birdie
that was
kind of thing.
Hawking's attempt to try to get around it. So when Stephen Hawking, the best-selling science book of all time is Brief History of Time, Stephen Hawking. I think it still is. And he did a great job explaining the evidence showing that there's a beginning. But then he tried to get around it because the implications are you need a transcendent cause. So what he said was, well, you don't really need a beginning, and he tried to get to that model of it, but that's been rejected by science.
So let's pause for a moment because you said something really important that I want to gloss over just now. You said that the implication, what the beginning of the universe implies is a transcendent cause. That's really important to pause on for a moment because the reaction to the beginning, in the beginning of the idea of a beginning, was that scientific genesis.
That's what he called it.
And the reason is that it was dismissive, saying, look, you're just basically injecting God into something, aren't you? Aren't you guys worried that you're injecting God into something? That kind of thing. In other words, Hoyle was saying to you, Einstein and Hubble, is that sounds to me like it's a little bit of religious implications being brought into the conversation.
And once it was proven, the Bible made, you can give a dozen predictions the Bible made about what you'd find about the origin of the universe and the cause, properties of the cause. When the head of NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies, Robert Jastrow, he has a quote that's been thrown around, and it's pretty telling.
Yeah.
What he wasn't a believer in the Bible or anything.
Robert Jastrow, just so
Robert
that's clear.
Jastrow, yeah. And his quote is echoed. I can give you a bunch of other quotes from other astrophysicists involved. They're saying the same thing. What he basically said was, he said, scientists were climbing the mountain of ignorance. And the more we studied and learned, and especially when you hit what some people are calling the greatest discoveries of all time about the beginning of the universe and the ripples and all that, he said, we're finally reaching the peak where then we can show this is how science can explain everything and you don't need a God. When the scientists finally get to that peak, what did they find? They found a band of theologians who've been sitting up there for centuries.
Yeah.
Because this is not reading science into the Bible. This was known. The Bible alone predicted that there was time had a beginning, space had a beginning, all of matter and energy, space and time all began concurrently out of what was not in existence before. Number of things like that. And that was 3,500 years before modern science figured out the same. And predictions, when you can predict something no one should know, that's a very strong evidence in science pointing to the validity of a theory or a model. And this it wasn't only predicting it millennia in advance of modern science, it was predicting it against every other belief system, including atheism, agnosticism. Science didn't believe it up until like Einstein's time, Hubble, and so on. And it was against common sense.
Mm-hmm.
You would expect there to be something in existence already, and then something maybe changed from there. And that was the general understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Cyclical universe or whatever, or the universe just always was something of it.
This is important because there's a contrast between sort of the biblical creation account and other ancient Near Eastern accounts, either contemporaneous with the Bible's writing, including in Genesis,
Mm-hmm.
or roughly contemporaneous with it, where most of the ancient myths about creation were about even the gods themselves, or even the titans before the gods in terms of Greek mythology, emerged from the ether. In other words, something always existed.
Exactly.
What you have is demigods, essentially, that aren't really gods in the sense that they are the creators of all things. And this is important because I'm going to get philosophical for just a moment and then get back to the cause stuff, is that the objection will be made and has been made. Well, if God created everything, who made God? The reason why I'm bringing this up is because that objection would actually be valid in every other system of ancient Near Eastern pagan belief, or whether it's in the Babylonian accounts of creation, or the any Mesopotamian, Sumerian accounts of creation, because those gods actually emerged from something. They emerged from a pre-existent ether. So they're not necessary beings. The Christian perspective is not that God is a being among other beings, is that God is the source of all being. He is the necessary being. Nothing exists apart from God's existence. And so there has to be an endpoint. You keep going back infinitely. What caused the universe? Well, this thing caused the universe. Well, what caused the thing that caused the universe? At some point, you can't have an infinite regress. You've got to stop somewhere. And that is a necessary being, a being that cannot not exist. And that being, by definition, is God. And so the objection that you would say something like, who created God? That's a nonsense statement, because you're saying, who created that which is not created? You can't say it, nothing. It's like saying, who married how can you have a married bachelor? You can't have it. The terms exclude themselves. So you can't have a created, uncreated thing. And therefore you have to have even, sort of different than Aristotle and Socrates and these guys about the unmoved mover. But that's what you're essentially arguing for is. So when we talk about God as the beginning of the universe, I want to stop there just for pause so we can dispel the idea that we simply have created an arbitrary stopping point. It's not arbitrary. Philosophically speaking, there's got to be a necessary being. So with that backdrop in mind, let's go then and talk about these causes we're talking about. Mm-hmm. What are the trends towards believing not only the standard model tells us that everything began to exist, and what does that tell us about the character of this cause?
Well, it gives us properties.
Okay.
So science can study initial conditions and natural laws and explain things from that. When you're talking about, and it studies it in nature. When you're talking about before nature, science doesn't really see that.
Yeah. By definition, it can't.
It can't.
It's not a limitation, it's just a definition.
Right. However, they are able to, within our science circle, with the stuff we can study, we can learn the properties of something that is necessary outside of nature. And that's exactly what we get.
Okay.
So here's how it goes. So there's a great little thing, I think Nova did it, and Jana Levin, she's a professor of astronomy and physics. In this video, she says, here's what we know. This is the origin of the universe. She said, it began in an instant. All matter, energy, space, and time came into existence. And then she goes back and says, now let's make this a little bit more clear. A lot of people think there was some existing space or something, and then it came into, no, there was not anything of nature.
So the Big Bang didn't blow up into something.
No.
It is everything. It was nothing and then became everything.
It is all matter, energy, space, time, everything that is, we call this universe or nature, came into existence. So there was not anything of nature, then all of nature came into existence. Mm-hmm. Now, if all of nature came into existence here, what do we know about the cause that led to it?
Yeah.
If nature is brought into existence here, The cause has to be beyond nature because nature is what was created.
Right, and things don't create themselves. Out of
No.
nothing comes.
You can write that X leads to Y. You can't really have an X creates X. That's nonsense.
Yeah.
So we now know, because of modern science discoveries, that we have a cause that has the property of being outside of or beyond nature. And you can call it supernatural, metaphysical, whatever term you want to use it. It is beyond or transcends all of nature.
So pause, because one might say, oh, but Lawrence Krauss proved in his book, A Universe Out of Nothing, that you can't have a universe out of nothing because of the quantum vacuum fluctuations.
Lawrence Krauss is a good, he's good with science. I think he's the one that talks about, gave Star Trek. He was like one of their sources of info for Star Trek, I think.
Like a consultant.
Yeah, but he's completely wrong.
Okay.
Scientists have just hammered him for that. A quantum vacuum. Okay, so the space and what they call the fabric of space-time now, because they're connected. The fabric of space-time is when you think of the most empty vacuum in space, where there's not any dust or anything like that. That is still a fabric of space-time that was created at that beginning point. Inside that fabric, it's roiling with energy.
Okay.
So let's say now my hand's energy. Because of E equals mc squared, I can have a quantum vacuum fluctuation, and it fluctuates into a particle and then it goes right back to energy.
Okay.
That's what a quantum vacuum fluctuation is.
Okay.
It is not coming out of nothing. It is coming out of the space-time fabric that is full of that dark energy. And
so it's got to fluctuate, for lack of a better word, if I can say it this way. And if I'm wrong, you please correct us, because we need to make sure we're accurate. Essentially, what you're saying is that it's got to have something to fluctuate in.
Fluctuate from, even. I mean,
okay.
Yeah. So it's the quantum vacuum particle that pops into existence. It's coming from the energy. It's just the energy turning into it and then going back to energy.
Yeah. The analogy of fingers turning into a fist is the fist didn't come from nothing. It came from the energy that was fluctuating.
Exactly right.
And the standard model says that all matter, energy, space, and time, including quantum energy states at a quantum level, are still something.
Yeah. That's what was created.
Okay.
It doesn't create itself.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah,
gotcha.
That's not possible.
So
that's
continue.
nonsense.
I had to pause this for a moment because that's obviously a popular book.
Yeah,
but we'll say that. So go ahead.
Yep. But thankfully, scientists, they even if they didn't disagree, even if they agree with them theologically, they still hammer as science, because that was bad science.
Yeah. Okay.
Bad definition, so that's bad philosophy. So then, so one property is it has to be outside of all matter, energy, space. It has to be outside of nature.
Yeah.
Second thing is it has to be outside of time, because time was created with this beginning. If you're outside of time, you either have access to a different dimension of time, or you're just outside of it, whatever that is. I don't have experience with that, so I can't give a great. I can't give a great analogy of that.
Yeah.
So you have a cause that is outside of all of nature, outside of time. There's law of entropy. I'll just make a simple thing of it. You start with a certain amount of power, which is ability to do work over time, to do things. You start with a certain amount, and over time you're using it up, and you eventually will run into what they call heat death. When you hit maximum entropy, you've used up everything you can, so you got a cold, dark, dead universe. I mean, the most that could happen is maybe you're still expanding, but nothing. There's no stars shining. You've used the energy up. Now, if you go backwards in time, you go to that very beginning, it had the most amount of power this universe ever had. The cause has to be greater than its effect. So whatever caused all that to come into existence has to have more power than the sum of all the power in the universe.
So that's really important. Okay, this is a great. So when you're taking the curve back, I mean, this is so important to just focus on for a moment. It's worth repeating. Is that the universe in its current state, energy is neither created nor destroyed, obviously. No. It just exists, but in different states. But it's being either used, it's either its potential and all that stuff, but it's being used. And so it doesn't go away, it just is diffused over the system, so to speak. And currently, the universe cannot possibly be as powerful, have as much energy, usable energy, as it once did, because over time, because entropy tells us that energy, it dissipates over the system over time.
Yeah. And it can in pockets. You can have pockets where order actually increases, or you can have pockets of things like that. But when you take the entire system
overall,
it always uses it up.
And just as a point of clarity too, and hopefully this is helpful for our listeners.
Mhm.
Does that only obtain in a closed system, or is that in an open system? And what if the universe is an open system?
If it's an open system, that they've looked into that.
Okay.
That's where the multiverse comes in.
Okay.
And we'll talk about that.
So
Because
we'll get to that in a moment.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I didn't want to overlook it. Okay.
Mhm.
So keep going.
Yeah.
Entropy.
So now you have the cause is outside of all of nature. It's outside of time. It has more power than all the sum of the universe at its most powerful.
Yep.
It has to be able to violate the laws of nature. One of the laws of nature is matter and energy is neither created nor destroyed, yet all matter and energy was created at that beginning.
Mm-hmm.
That's a violation of the law of nature.
This is funny, Scott, because I remember talking to somebody either during a Q&A or after a talk on science and faith, and someone said, the problem with your view is that it goes right against the very basis. You're using science to prove that, or to indicate that God exists, and yet you have to be willing to violate the very principle that matter and energy are neither created nor destroyed. And I said, that's the point. Exactly.
That's exactly the point.
Yeah.
Because how do you account for that with a naturalistic explanation? Initial conditions and natural laws, there was no natural laws in place or initial conditions. It all came into existence.
Right.
So now if it's an open system because you have a multiverse, fine, but the multiverse is subject to the exact same thing of this. It just pushes it back a step. A multiverse, Borguth and Vilenkin, they'd spent like 10 years and 5 papers adding to the space-time theorems, and what their basic conclusion was, even if there's a multiverse, it requires a beginning with the exact same properties of a cause that we're talking now. It just pushes it back a step.
So just for the audience to say too, Borguth and Vilenkin
Yeah.
are
Astrophysicists.
and they are, if I'm not mistaken, they are, along with a few others, Roger Penrose and other folks like this too, are essentially the developers of what amounts to the standard model.
They've added the space-time theorems to it, and
Right.
they're some of the ones where when you have a dying theory, it branches off in different directions and they start failing. When you have a solid theory, you have different things kind of coalesce to it, and it just keeps growing with the evidence and different things going to it, and that's
you have
what
a
we're
tower,
seeing.
not a tree.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So these are not specifically Christian people.
Actually, none are believers.
Yeah, but and they're as objective as they can possibly be on this stuff, given the human nature. And they're basically saying that you can't get away from the beginning.
Not with an expanding universe, which is what was required for life like ours has.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's pause for a moment then, and I do want to talk about multiverse because it bleeds over, of course, into the design issues as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to say something about that, but not get into design just yet. When you look at the cause of the universe, you haven't really, a multiverse doesn't get you beyond the beginning of anything. It might get you to say that our universe began to exist and it's one of an infinite number of multiverses. Mm-hmm. But you still have an issue with the beginning of that multiverse, either the engine behind the multiverse or the multiverses themselves.
Right.
Is that right?
You would still, okay, so let's just for sake of argument say that our universe is part of a multi-universe. It's one of the bubble universes, or there's an infinite number, and there's some kind of multi-universe generator, mm-hmm. some overall big system. Eventually you get to a closed system, yeah. Even this big overarching multiverse, it too must have a beginning and a cause with the same properties that we're dealing, even if there wasn't a multiverse.
Okay.
So it just pushes it back a step.
Okay. I also see that there are I think there's some philosophical problems with an infinite number of anything.
Yeah.
Because, and to take the classic example of the infinite library, where you have, let's say you have an infinite number of red books and an infinite number of black books in this library. And the odd-numbered books are red, and the even-numbered books are black. If I took all the black books out of the library, I would have removed an infinite number of books out of the library. And what I'd be left with is an infinite number of books.
So infinity minus infinity equals infinity.
Yeah, and that mathematically, in other words, infinity mathematically is a nice tool to get to certain things. But in reality, as an abstraction, it works, but as a reality, it begins to break down.
You can only really have a potential of infinite. Like
right.
You can have a potential infinite,
mm-hmm.
but never an actual. Really.
Yeah.
It just doesn't really work philosophically.
Yeah, and if you had an infinite regress of things, you'd never get to now.
Never get to now.
Yeah,
right.
You could never start, because where do you start from? If you have a timeline where, let's say now is 1,
Yeah.
And let's say just we use negative numbers. You go back to 0, -1, -2, -3. You have an infinite number of those instances in the past. You could never begin counting to now, so you'd never have a now.
Right.
But we clearly have a now.
Mhm.
So you can't have an infinite regress of actual events, nor could you have an infinite number of actual things as well, because it doesn't make any mathematical sense. So I think there's an issue there as well, and maybe there's some kind of metaphysical thing I'm missing, and I'm perfectly open to the possibility that I am.
There's a long discussion into it, but it's the evidence seems a lot more strongly to that it's just not possible to have an actual infinite.
So it doesn't push anything. It doesn't really avoid a beginning. It just pushes it back, which doesn't really do anything anyway, as you've pointed out. So what are some of the trending data or some of the things we see towards a cause? We obviously have just the philosophical ideas of a cause.
Well, there's also, if you look at the properties, you also have something that works. So if you have something outside of nature, that's supernatural by definition.
Right.
If you have something outside of time, that is itself a first cause. Scientists and philosophers knew there had to be an initial first cause, uncaused first cause.
Yeah.
They just assumed it was the universe itself. That's why it was blew their minds when they saw that the universe had a beginning, because now it needs an uncaused first cause.
Yeah.
So we have a outside of nature, supernatural, eternal, an uncaused first cause. That's eternal. All powerful, or at least more powerful than the whole universe, powerful put together. Miracle working. If you can violate the laws of nature, that's miracle working. And it has to be sufficient to explain the fine tuning that we're going to talk about.
Okay.
What does that sound like to you?
Right.
I mean, and this isn't me trying to put science into the Bible. This was written thousands of years before science found out these same things. So these are predictive things about the properties of the cause of the universe that now science now validates. And you can get a bunch of quotes saying, it looks like we're stuck with a supernatural cause of the universe.
So at the end of the day, when it comes to some of the cause stuff, what you end up having is a case, at the very least you have the ability to draw inferences from the data we have through science that I could infer, therefore, that the universe had a cause, and that cause, the leap, not a leap, but the thing we have to establish yet is that cause is personal. It could be some kind of super force, Paul Davies, who thinks that the universe itself has some kind of a supernatural quality to it.
Except that all those have been disproven now.
Okay, so go through that.
Okay, so in all science and philosophical literature, there is...
So this is just pause. We're trying to talk about whether or not there's a cause. That's fine. There's got to be some kind of a cause.
Right.
Now, how do we know that cause is personal? And then we're going to get to how do we know that cause is biblical? Okay, go ahead.
Right. So, and you have to take the whole comprehensive case.
Yeah, of course.
This cause right now, it doesn't necessarily prove Jesus.
Right.
Or the Christian model. It could prove a different personal...
Of course.
So you're totally right. You got to take the comprehensive case, but they are all links in the chain that link together.
Of course.
And when you got that comprehensive case,
and our audience will know that I've given I have a couple episodes on cumulative cases.
Yeah, excellent.
But also circumstantial cases, which are just as strong as direct cases.
It circumscribes the answer.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. Hence the name. Yep.
Yeah. Excellent. So. If you go through all the science literature and the philosophical literature, there's basically 5 general possible causes of the origin of the universe.
Okay.
Now, let's say you had a piece of paper, fold it in half. 4 of them are on the not personal, not purposeful side, and there's 1 on the personal, purposeful cause. The 4 on this side have 3 things in common. They don't have evidential support now. They have fatal invalidations based on what modern science has found. And and they don't meet the properties required that we talked about for the cause.
Okay.
This side does.
Okay.
Now, on this side, let's look at some of them. One of them is just a natural cause. They just said the universe was eternal. It was always there. Or something in nature. There was a space and then it somehow coalesced and popped out with quantum vacuum stuff. That's disproven. That's the idea of naturalism. You can explain everything with nature. Now we know you can't because nature is what was created.
Yeah.
So that's out. Quantum vacuum fluctuations, that's out. An eternal universe, which most Eastern religions believe in, that the universe was eternal. Maybe it started from a cosmic egg that started or whatever. Those are all invalidated. Atheism believed that, like Carl Sagan, the cosmos is all that is, was, or ever will be. Invalidated. So that's not possible. What if it's something outside of nature but that's like a supernatural type of nature. It's just a different type of nature. Okay, yeah, that's possible. Except from what we know about science makes it not possible. So the nature of nature is it's ceaselessly changing. So again, with entropy, it's going to be using up over time. Now, it could take 10 billion years for a certain atom to actually decay, but it's eventually going to use that up and then be done.
Okay.
So if there was some different type of nature, like, for example, the multiverse, it would have ran out of energy by now. We wouldn't have any stars shining because all energy would have been used up an infinite time ago.
Across the entirety of the multiverse.
Across the entirety of the multiverse, it'd be just a cold, dark, dead universe. That's it.
If it was infinitely...
Nothing can happen except possibly expansion of space. That's it.
Yeah, if it was infinite in one sense.
If it was a multiverse or any... So that's not... So some different type of nature outside of nature, that's not possible. But they said, well, maybe if it's a nature outside of time, you claim God's outside of time, what if nature's outside of time? That also doesn't work. If you look at all the physics equations, whether it's stated directly or not, time is one of the variables in the equation. So if you look at, again, my area, radioactive decay of an atom, time is in there. When you take time to zero, whatever you start with is what you end up with, meaning there is no change.
Okay, yeah.
So if there was some supernatural type of thing that was outside of nature and outside of time, but it didn't have the ability to choose when to do something different because it's outside of time, then it simply does, it never changes. It would have always existed as is. Because if at any point it could have changed, because let's say water melting the ice, at some point there's going to be a phase transition or whatever, it would have hit it a long time ago and already been used up all its whatever. But if there's no time, it can't change. It can't have any transition.
It would always be ice.
Unless it had the ability to make a choice.
I see.
The last possibility on the no personal creator side or cause is abstract objects. This is where quantum gravity comes in. So Hawking said, you don't need a God. Where you can have quantum gravity. So basically, we understand how gravity works through Einstein's work. And so we understand how it works all the way down until you get to quantum size. But the thing was, our universe started...
Quantum size is it's just infinitesimally small.
Oh, yeah.
Like subatomic.
Oh, yeah, subatomic small. And the thing is, our universe, if you take it back, because since it's expanding, they said, well, let's take that backwards.
Yep.
You coming back, it compresses into a size that's infinitely small, right around Planck time. So then, when you're hitting that...
Planck time is, my understanding is, it's the measure... Sorry, make sure we define our terms. Planck time essentially is the amount of time it takes the fastest thing to cross the shortest distance. So it's essentially how fast would light cross the distance between subatomic particles.
Okay.
Yeah.
So and so basically we can understand how the universe was all the way back in time to that point.
Yeah.
But we can't go beyond that because we need quantum gravity to start describing that, because gravity doesn't operate that same when you get to that level.
Okay.
What you need then is you need a quantum gravity understanding, which we don't have yet.
Okay.
No, so Hawking says, well, once we explain that, then that's what, that could be the cause. But laws of nature describe things, they don't do anything.
Right.
So abstract objects are things like, one person had an idea, he said, well, it's swirling mathematical points is what caused the universe. What that is, a little number 7 bouncing around.
Yeah.
But they've had different theories about abstract objects, but they're missing the definition, the philosophy. You got to get your definitions right. By the definition, abstract objects don't exist in cause and effect relationships. They describe things. So a quantum gravity will describe how quantum gravity works, but if there's nothing to work on, it describes nothing.
And that's why when Hawking says, because there's a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself.
That's a quote. And again, he stepped into philosophy and he did bad philosophy there.
Right. But the point is that gravity only exists as it's a law that describes the interactions of things.
And things,
if there are no things, they can't actually interact.
That's exactly
Therefore,
right.
There's actually no law of gravity because there's nothing to describe.
That's it.
That's good. And also abstract objects, in that sense, are effete. I mean, the number 7. You brought up number 7. The number 7 doesn't do anything.
It's just impotent to create anything.
Right. It just either describes the number of Skittles that are on the table, or and that's it. But it doesn't actually do anything. And since the universe itself has causes, these kinds of things don't cause anything.
No.
They might exist in the mind of something,
Right.
But they don't, and that thing itself would have to be an abstract mind, not in the sense of it's kind of a mind, but it is a transcendent mind. Anyway, so.
Which brings us to our last. Those 4 causes here, the non-personal causes, they don't have supportive evidence. They have fatal flaws that invalidate them, and they can't meet all the properties of a cause we talked about. We're on the other side of the paper now. The only other thing in all philosophical and scientific literature, at least that I've seen, is an immaterial mind, meaning it's beyond nature, something that exists beyond nature, that has the ability to make choices. So it's a personal cause. And this not only matches the properties predicted 3,000 years before science figured out the same, outside of nature, outside of time, miracle working, more powerful than the universe put together, and ability to make choice. Not only does it match the properties, when you look at explanatory power, explanatory scope, predictive ability, trends of evidence, cumulative case, the evidence puts this biblical model on a theory that no other source matches. It's on a level all its own. And so if you want to say now, well, people will say, well, we don't really know what caused the universe. Yeah, you can say that. Of course you can say that. Science can't see that. So it can show properties, but you can't say that and be reasonable, rational, or thoughtful in your beliefs, which is why I called the ministry Thoughtful Beliefs, because you can only be reasonable and rational and thoughtful if the reasons are on your side. So what you have is, if you don't want to believe there's a personal creator, okay, but don't claim you're doing it through reasons or rational thinking, because there is the reasons and rational thinking and thoughtfulness does not support these options. There is that evidential support for a transcendent creator that's personal. So if you want to say, well, we don't know what cause it is, you can say that. But if you want to claim that it's not a personal cause, well, then that's a delusional faith, because you're going against the evidence that is here. And that's what, an error in thinking called an ad futurus fallacy, where what you're basically...
Ad futurus. Yeah, go ahead.
If I pronounce that right.
I think you did.
What you're basically saying is, okay, when you're saying, well, we don't know what the cause is, you're basically saying, well, we don't have evidence supporting what I want to believe. There is evidence supporting this, but we're not going to look at that. We'll just wait until the evidence comes forth that'll support what we want.
Right. And I've actually talked about this before, either in other episodes of this podcast or in other areas too, where this idea of just wait, we'll explain it at some point. Well, okay, I get that. That's fine, because let's say we don't know the cures for certain things, or we don't know what causes certain things, but we will eventually. Maybe, yeah. But if we have evidence trending towards this is likely the cause of this disease, or this is why this phenomenon occurs, you dismissing it, so we'll wait, doesn't make any sense, because there's plenty of reasons to not wait. You can actually come to a conclusion now. Now, if that's disproven later, then you hold it provisionally. And I'm not saying you have a provisional faith. I'm saying if you hold this idea provisionally, saying I'm willing to accept or understand counter explanations, that's fine. But your explanation would be really quite good, because there's so much here on this side of it. So you mentioned that there's 4 here that have competed with the one here, and they've either have fatal flaws or no evidence, but this one doesn't suffer from the same flaws and has great evidence. If you create a 5th option on this side of the ledger, that option has to have none of the flaws that these have, and
greater support,
greater support than this one.
Yes.
Well,
then you're onto something. Then I'd have to be open to that.
Right. But we're not there yet. And so you're perfectly reasonable and rational to actually embrace the one that has none of the flaws and all the evidence.
You're more reasonable and rational than someone who doesn't.
Right. Given the current state of affairs.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I want to wrap up. We're going to have to go into something. This is another reason to have you on for another episode in the future. It won't be a part 3 to this one, but we're going to have you on again, and I'd love to do that as well for the future, is to the claim that essentially we're going to move over in design now, just for a moment, is that in order to, if you have these 4 and you have this one, in order to debunk this one, you basically have to say that the universe that we currently observe, the life-permitting universe we currently observe, And that's what we're talking about when it comes down to fine-tuning. We've been talking about, or to the existence of the universe. The universe as it exists now that allows for life to exist, we bleed over into design, which is basically the teleological argument is this universe looks like it was designed for the purpose of having life. Not just for a purpose where it all works, where, stars exist with planets that circle around them and they're all sort of speeding away from each other at various times, and quarks and, pulsars and all this stuff, quasars, I should say. Not that, but that life exists. There's that design in mind. So I want to shift just for a moment, because one of the critiques or one of the criticisms, or I shouldn't say that, one of the alternatives to the design argument is that the universe that we currently observe, which has life and permits life, is one of an infinite number. And if there's an infinite number of universes, it is a probability of one. It is going to happen that we're going to have a life-permitting universe. And that would logically be true if there are an infinite number of universes.
And they're able to generate the various forms needed to try through all the different parameters to finally get the right one in it. So there's a few things that have to be in place, but if all those things are in place, then yeah.
So, but let me start with this though. Let me ask you this question, and this is going to have to be a short question, and maybe another subject for another time. Is there's an assumption baked into that? The assumption baked into the claim that this universe was designed for the purpose of life assumes that there's evidence that points towards the fine-tuning of this universe so that there is life. And the multiverse would say, an infinite multiverse would say, yeah, but it's a probability of one. But you have to start with the idea, though, that life is improbable in any number of universes. And so this one is... Now, if there's an infinite number of universes, there's probably an infinite number of life-permitting universes as well. But the whole point of that is to suggest that we have to explain this universe in terms of its weirdness, in one sense, its uniqueness. Not unique, but its weirdness.
And this is well established. The scientific community, the general consensus is, and they started finding the stuff in like the 70s, and I could show you a graph where they expected it to go away, but instead, the number of things they found kept trending up into the hundreds.
What things did they find? Just to be clear, when you say things they found, what do you mean? Like indicators of what? Okay,
so for example, they found when you're studying the strong nuclear force.
Okay,
it's just it's one of those things in nature that it's a precise value. All right, they found that if this was just tweaked maybe 2% weaker, we would just have all radioactive elements and no life. If it was only 5% weaker, then chemistry class would be so easy because there'd only be hydrogen. So instead of the periodic table were reduced to hydrogen. That's it. Okay. We'd have a hot air balloon universe and no life. So they would find things like that, and they would find out, well, what are the odds that just by chance we landed right where we needed to? Now, when they first started finding this, they said, well, maybe you can just explain this by something else. Like when they found how much gravity would you need to be in we have a specific force of gravity. And they said, well, what if this constant was just changed a little bit this way or this way? And they're like, wow, we wouldn't have expanded correctly. We wouldn't exist if that was true. But then they said, well, is it really that? Or maybe you can explain it because there's an expansion force that balances it just right. So then they said, yeah, there is an expansion force.
So gravity causes things to contract. There's an expansion force that counteracts it, is what you're talking
exactly.
about.
Yeah. And they said, well, maybe there's something else that just is by necessity what it is or by chance, and it counteracts it. So it's not like it was perfectly landed where it was supposed to. But when they did that, they found, oh my goodness, there is an expansion force that's even more fine-tuned. It's like a Goldilocks universe, they called it. Everything's just right. And it's got to the point where they thought it would go away. But as they found over time, they're into the hundreds now. And the trend is every month, something new is found about the universe, ranging from size scales from the smallest quantum level all the way to the whole universe itself, where everything is just right. And the odds every month are 1 million times less likely that it happened by chance. So the reason why science has accepted this universe is fine-tuned is by the math, by the astronomical discovery, or just the basic discoveries of the universe and math. Make it to where you only have two options. And I have the quotes to show it. The guy who gave us the 4 different types of multiverse, Max Tegmark, him, Brandon Carr, Brandon Carr, even philosophers like Stephen, was it Weinstein or Weinberg? I think Weinberg. They all say this is well established. This universe, all these things are exactly where they need to be. Either there is a purposeful designer who made the choice for it to be that way, or there's an almost infinite multiverse. It doesn't have to be infinite. It has to be almost.
Okay.
And there's a specific type of universe. It had to be like a type 3 or 4.
Okay.
Those are your only options. One of the quotes is, if you don't want there to be a God, there better be a multiverse.
Okay. And we've already talked about, if there is one, it doesn't mean that there's no God. You just have to create a cause for that multiverse itself.
If there is a multiverse, then I'll have a little bit more realism and fun when I'm watching all my Marvel movies and stuff, because I love multiverse ideas. They're fantastic, creative-wise, but it remains in science fiction. There is level 1 multiverse that's probably accurate, but it's not really what people think it is. But the bottom line is, even if there is a multiverse, it is not going to explain away a God. In fact, it would need things to be kind of designed on a whole higher level.
Okay. So you just said something that we're going to have to, at some point in the future, unpack, is that there's a level 1 multiverse, because people are going to send me emails saying, there's a multiverse, come on. So we're going to have to unpack that later on.
Right.
But that doesn't have the implications that I think people think it does in terms of
it really
obviates design.
Our universe, it's bigger than what we can observe and know about.
Right. Yeah, so it's not like it's a thing that's beyond our universe. It's just our universe beyond our observable abilities.
Yeah.
Okay, well, there's a lot for us to digest in all that stuff. And the point here, though, the ultimate point is that given the current scientific state of affairs, and the trends as we see them. In fact, science is a wonderful thing because it does trend. It is provisional in the sense that we can have established sort of theories and established observations about the way things work, but we hold them provisionally because they're subject to modification. Now, we don't suddenly say, nope, gravity is not real because it's provisional. We're not holding it that way. We're saying as we modify our understandings and we fine-tune them, as it were. And some things we reject, some things we accept. But the trend is going towards design of the universe, and that it's going towards this universe had a cause, that the standard model, which basically says everything began to exist at a finite point in the past, is getting stronger, not weaker.
Yep.
And that the design of the universe as it exists for life to exist is getting more and more likely, given the factors that we're discovering more and more of.
Oh, it's past likely. It's to the point where if you don't believe it, you're on the fringe. And you're against the evidence.
Okay.
And that's what's so nice about trends. It overwhelms perspectives and opinions and biases and emotions, because over time, reality just steps over all of them and holds up the belief system that fits reality.
And so I just want to make sure I'm clear, is that because I want to make sure for the audience's sake, is that don't take that to be saying that if you run into a scientist who is a theoretical physicist or an experimental physicist or anything like that, that they're going to suddenly say, yeah, I believe in God. That's not what you're saying, that the consensus is not that God exists. That's not what we're saying.
Right. Yep.
It's very important for a good, for an apologist, for a good case maker of Christianity, not to overstate the claim. That's not what you're saying.
Correct.
What you're saying is that the trends are overwhelming to where someone could say fine-tuning is how we would describe this universe, and almost no one would say that's not how I would describe it.
Right. Right.
But the implications is a different story. What the conclusions they're willing to draw from it, that's different. That's a personal matter. But as far as the actual data goes, no one's really doubting the data anymore.
And the data is coming in from those non-believers. We're using their data to make the point.
Right. And audience members will remember that I had an episode in season 1 where I talked about various forms of evidence where we don't allow hearsay evidence in normally into courts unless there's there's an exception to the hearsay rule called statement against interest or an admission by a party opponent. And that basically says that things will be admitted into court of law even where they are otherwise inadmissible because they bear the indicia of reliability, because they come from someone who has no reason to fudge the data. And so in this particular instance, we're taking a lot of this data from people who don't believe in God necessarily, and some who do, but most who don't. And we're saying this is the data they're willing to concede. So it's pretty strong data indeed. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that wraps up part 2 of this very fast-paced, very information-rich conversation with my good friend Scott Symington on the objection. Science has given us no more room for faith. In fact, I would say it actually has given us reason to increase our faith. And so the objection, at least at this stage, is overruled. But that's up for you to decide, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. So as we conclude, the evidence is there for you to see and to seek out. So verify the things you've heard Scott say. Verify the claims that I've made. You are the jury. It's not for me to tell you what to believe. I can present to you what I believe, and Scott can tell you what he believes based on the evidence. But it is up for you to decide, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. You are the finder of fact. You are the finder of the ultimate conclusion. It is your verdict that matters, especially and including for you personally. So we've presented something here for us to think about, and we're looking forward to the next time we all meet on All Rise. And until then, the defense rests.